Oh, hello there. Yes, well, it really still is. Yeah, it's hot water bottle territory. Don't want to stay in, don't want to go out. Yes, me and Joe Jackson both. Anyway, today I thought we'd delve into the mysteries that are DEI. Who knows what it is? But we all know what it's a bad thing. Oh, yes, I'm going to point you to a couple of articles and suggest perhaps that maybe we're being led up the garden path, as we so often are by our friends in the media. Yes, friend number one inevitably is James Esses, here writing with Matt Goodwin. Matt Goodwin, Poundland Mr. Murray, isn't he? Yes. That veneer, the thinnest of veneers of respectability around the nastiness that is reform. But we get this James Esses, Starmer's hypocrisy on the rape gangs. Yes, hypocrisy. Be awful to be a hypocrite, wouldn't it? Probably. Anyway, let's have a look at this. Political correctness and an obsession with diversity, equality and inclusion, DEI, are facilitating the rape gang epidemic in the United Kingdom. Yes, indeed, it's all that political correctness gone mad. Yeah, something I've been hearing for 40 years. It's always awful. The words change. You may recall a few years ago it was critical race theory, but nobody could really get their heads around exactly what that was. So they've now latched onto the whole American DEI thing, and we might well sort of unpack that a bit later on. But yes, strong words, I know, says James. Yes, he does like his strong words, doesn't he? Yes, but it's true. Everywhere we turn, not you, we, there are senior figures sending a clear message to the British public that to even note the correlation between men of a certain ethnicity, religion and or rape gang scandal that has plagued our country, and it is continuing today, makes you an unsavoury character deserving of moral judgment. Ah, yes, indeed, and you may well be wondering what that's all about, because of course there has been no coverage whatsoever for weeks on end about the whole Pakistani grooming gang scandal, in inverted commas, and the demands on the government to do something about it, which they have done something about, but it still isn't the right thing, because after all we can make a lot of political capital out of it. But I'm sure you haven't heard anything about that, because it certainly hasn't been in the news, because you know what the news is like, the way that they completely suppress these things. Again, might well come back to that as a concept. Yeah. Anyway, you can read Mr. S's article itself, but I just want to highlight the end of it, because he does that classic thing whereby he says, oh, there's this horrible thing called DEI, and it's going to end up with raped children. And you say to him, metaphorically or otherwise, well, how will that happen? He go, oh, well, all that DEI stuff is all about, making sort of racists feel bad. And something children. Which in essence is what we get here, as well as being blindingly wrong. Anyway, yet, when we consider other inquiries in existence, it becomes clear that there are serious double standards. Yes, that hypocrisy thing. Take the Sheku Boya public inquiry, for example. OK, James, we will. This has been running since 2020 and has cost British taxpayers a staggering $22 million to date. Yes, they are very expensive with all those lawyers and everything. We could do this system differently, James, but then you complain about that because it would involve a cover-up. But there we are. Bayo is originally from Sierra Leone, yes. In case you were wondering just exactly how Irish that name was, it's important that he's not British, like us, okay? Us. It's important, that one. He was found running around the streets of Kirkcaldy brandishing a large kitchen knife, trying to get into random cards after taking a cocktail of drugs. When police arrived, he knocked a female police officer unconscious and stamped on her head. As police restrained him, he lost consciousness and died shortly after. The inquiry, in part, is to consider whether his race, you notice in inverted commas, contributed to his death. One man high on drugs posed a significant danger to the public, yet a public inquiry was launched, probably because of his skin colour. Come back to that in a second. However, now Starmer's government is refusing to launch a national inquiry into the thousands upon thousands of young white girls who were groomed and raped by Pakistani men in the UK and failed by police, local authorities and social services. Yes, except of course what James is deliberately missing here, and hoping that you won't notice, is that anyone that dies in police custody would have an inquiry launched into their death. It has nothing to do with race. James, but you've decided to make it that. You're the one who is making this into a racial issue. Just want to make that very, very clear, because I think these things are often important, that those people that argue that we must always be honest looking at the facts in and around race often sort of, aren't very keen on actually dealing with the facts. And you'll notice that he conflates two completely different things there. He conflates somebody who died in police custody with sexual assault of children. Now, I don't want to shock you, but the two things are not necessarily correlated at all. And the fact that we have a public inquiry into a death in police custody, which is basically is a legal mandate, doesn't necessarily mean therefore that government has to do anything about anyone else who's brown because James or Matt or anyone else wants him to. But never mind that. Anyway, to finish with James, if only I could. Over the years, I've witnessed the immense harm caused to vulnerable children who were indoctrinated to believe they were born in the wrong body. This harm was, in part, able to be perpetrated through shutting down and labelling anyone who took part as transphobic. Unfortunately, we are now witnessing exactly the same phenomenon, with those taking a stand against the rape gangs being labelled racist or far-right. Yes, it's all about James. Anyway, when it comes to protecting children, no topic of debate should be off the table, regardless of whether it offends or who it offends. So I say this to those that are publicly shaming others for trying to help our children. You are part of the problem, not the solution. And it's time you get out of the way so we can get the national inquiry that those girls, their families, and the proper British people deserve. Which is why our community will never stop speaking up for them and magnifying their voice. Yes, indeed. You see, it's got to have an inquiry, even though they take forever to do and very, very expensive. But yes, indeed. You notice here though that James is doing that classic thing whereby he is the victim here. Yeah, that classical thing that they don't like about political correctness or wokeism or critical race theory or DEI stuff, which is whereby certain people get to be victims. And of course, James is the victim here. He, along with, for example, all of those people at Sex Matters, like Julie Blindell and Helen and the rest of them, of course, are always perpetually the victim. And they are forever, ever being platformed to tell us that they don't have a platform. And, they are the wronged people here. And James, you may notice here, has made a very carved out a very nice niche for himself and makes presumably a very good living on the coattails of Matt Goodwin now by being basically a professional, use that word quite advisedly, as I'm sure some of you will know, a professional whinger about this stuff, except now, of course, he's managed to expand his empire into the notion of race. But if we really are serious about protecting young people, I think we need, to protect them from people that aren't qualified, James, but hey, that's just me being bitchy. But perhaps we do need a national debate about sexual violence against children, because unfortunately for someone like me, what I tend to see is, for example, a lot of institutional bodies that are accused of not wanting to do anything about brown people that actually often seem to be the perpetrators of very, very nasty crimes. One may think of the Metropolitan Police with certain WhatsApp groups and certain individuals who got done for, stuff that perhaps is really, 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 really unpleasant. Yes, indeed. Will there be a national inquiry? Why aren't you demanding a national inquiry? How come it is that you yourself seem to have these double standards? I personally don't. I think that if we're going to tackle issues in and around child sexual abuse and sexual abuse generally, we need to be have an honest discussion about these things. Unfortunately, we don't get that. What we do is we get those people that have a very distinct political and racial, and often on the back of that, a political agenda, like James, or indeed the delightful Zoe Strimple, who cropped up in the Telegraph yesterday on a very similar thing. DEI isn't just a waste of money, it's dangerous. Oh God, yes. Yes, because we get DEI and then something, the Holocaust. So Trump's war on this pernicious ideology is vital if the rise of contemporary anti-Semitism is to be combated. Yes, you see, because if you have quotas for people in jobs, then I'm not quite sure either. But anyway, let's read the pertinent paragraphs or two. Under the aegis, good use of that word, a DEI schemes, federal or otherwise, there has been thought policing via mandatory unconscious bias training. Yes, mandatory unconscious bias training, which loads of companies will sort of mandate people to do. And you would have thought, or at least I would think, if you're in the public sector, it might be an idea. One might think of, the police, for example. Anyway, the curtailment of free expression, no matter how respectful, and an increase in bullying as bosses enforce their ideology. Yes, those evil bosses, like all the ones that have decided now to fall in line with Trump. You may remember that the evil Mark Zuckerberg has stopped being equal, and now he's just great, isn't he? Especially with that hair. Diversity of thought has been under attack. Of course, diversity, notice what she's done there, thanks to the expulsion or exclusion of those who deviate from contemporary wokeness. Yes. And again, I'll point you to The Spectator, The Daily Telegraph, Julia Hartley-Brewer on Talk TV, all of GBNews, Matt Goodwin, the whole crew at Spiked, platforming all those people that aren't allowed to be platformed. You can't make it up. Meanwhile, equity has laid waste the idea of meritocracy because it says people from allegedly marginalised backgrounds should get a big leg up throughout the hiring and promotion process based on skin colour or gender identity alone, which it actually doesn't. But of course, that isn't the issue here. You see, they are assuming that you won't actually know what equality, 2010 for example, equalities legislation actually does involve. You will hear all these horror stories. I mean, Darren Grime the other day had this horror story whereby if two people are going for the same job and they are equally tied in terms of the number of points they get for a job, it will go to one of the people that's not so represented in the organisation, which Darren said was blatantly anti-white. But one has to ask, how come that would work if there weren't that many white people in the organisation, Darren? Not thought through that one, have we? No, of course not, because the issue isn't to think through this. The issue is to present you with certain groups of people being victims, like white people or Jewish people in the case of Zoe. As one of DEI's ideology's most poisonous side effects has been a sharp rise, not just in anti-Semitism, but its acceptability. And again, really, that's a hell of a leap. It really is. When what we saw taking place on US campuses from Harvard to Columbia to UCLA last spring as progressive brigands, good use of the word, in Caiaphas, took to their megaphones to denounce Zionist and unmistakably Hitlerian terms was directly in line with DEI culture as it has come to be understood in the Anglosphere. Now, what, of course, Zoe is doing there is she's suddenly leaping from one thing to another. I'm sorry, but I think it's perfectly valid for young people to have concerns about what's going on in Gaza. I know I do, and I'm not that young. Now, do I have concerns about what's going on in Gaza because I'm a vicious anti-Semite? Possibly, I might be, but it's more likely that I'll have concerns about what's going on in Gaza because I have a basic understanding of what it is to be human, and I can understand that it must be quite painful to be, bombed or starved. It's as simple as that. But of course for Zoe, she is part of a marginalised group, historically, who have to be protected. Protected status for her, yeah? But not for other people. Just for her. And she complains in the article about this notion about hierarchies of racism. Well, you have it there in a nutshell. And of course, what we're presented with all of this stuff is the idea that diversity is very, 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 very bad and anti-white. And equity, well, why can't we just have good people? Yes, and inclusion. We should all be more inclusive and get together. But, of course, you may have noticed a couple of years ago when we were being presented with the Conservative glorious ministers sitting around the table with Boris Johnson or indeed some of the others, that diversity was a really brilliant thing because the Labour Party weren't doing it. And inclusion, it just showed what an inclusive country we are. So we can't have racism in this country. Doesn't exist. Remember that? It doesn't exist. Unless, of course, it does now because Darren says that white people like him are oppressed or something. Yeah? And inclusion, because it's so inclusive. Think about the meritocracy at work with such luminaries as on display here, like Priti Patel, a woman that always fails to exactly the same level of not being leader, and the rest of them. And you can point, if you like, to Kemi Badenoch, but I would argue that the reason probably that Kemi Badenoch has the job is because she's a woman and is because she's black. Yes, how does that fit in? Yes, because it sure as hell isn't based on talent. And we think about Liz. Oh yes, she ticks the box by having yet another woman because the Labour Party have never had a female leader. But was that talent? Theresa May? Hard to say, really, isn't it? But of course, at the heart of this is a political project whereby they want to get rid of these kind of programmes because they dislike them purely on an ideological ground. And that's fine, you're allowed to do that. But one has to say, well, OK then, so you get rid of all of these programmes. Do we keep Equalities Law? Do we keep, the original Race Relations Equal Pay Act? Do we keep those? Because if we do, then you have to say to yourself, well, how will we know that we're meeting our targets in a large organisation? And the answer is, well, we'd need to monitor it. And then if we're going to monitor it, then, we need people to monitor it, obviously. We might want to call them, human resources people. But then we'd need to think about whether or not we're simply employing, vast numbers of white middle-class blokes from public schools. And if we are, we might think that that's not necessarily a brilliant thing for our company to do, in which case we'd need those human resources officers to look at the diversity it's not a good idea. We should scrap all that legislation after all. And that way, of course, everything for the companies hiring people becomes a lot easier because they don't have to spend any money on their human resources department. They can just employ their friends from public school. So once again, the white middle-class blokes will win. But that's okay because, I'm sure they present no threat to people whatsoever, unlike the Pakistanis. Unless, of course, they're middle-class Pakistani guys that went to public school, in which case apparently they're okay as well. But that just shows my limited understanding of everything, presumably. Unlike, of course, James Esses or Matt Goodwin or Darren Grimes or Zoe Strimple or the rest, because they really understand these things and are quite happy to, have a very coherent argument, as indeed I think I've shown you only too well. Anyway, do have a glorious end towards the weekend. How do we get the weekend? I don't know. It must have been the wokists. We need to scrap that next. It's coming, folks. It's coming. Just don't hold your breath.